Travel Often, a podcast about food, travel, the environment, mind, body, and spirit. I'm Melissa Goldberg, and over the course of my adult life, I've been focused on how to build an integrated community around food, health, wellness, and the environment. These are all related. Understanding these interrelationships helps us look at life as a holistic system and teaches us how to connect with each other to create a loving and thriving community. On Eat Well, Travel Often, I talk to farmers, foragers, cookbook authors, doctors, scientists, and entrepreneurs. All have one thing in common. The people I speak with are trying to better everyone's lives through their work and passion. These are the people who inspire me to be a better person. I hope to share with you my curiosity from everything from book to plate. And the goal of these conversations are to inspire you to eat well and travel often. Today's interview could not be more timely. This past Friday, March 13th, I spoke with Maryn McKenna, an independent journalist and author specializing in public health, global health, and food policy. When I first reached out to interview her, I was fascinated to talk to her about her book, Big Chicken, the incredible story of how antibiotics created modern agriculture and changed the way the world eats. But since the outbreak of the coronavirus, I pivoted our conversation to discuss what we all are concerned about. Not only has she reported from farms and food production sites, but on epidemics and disasters, including a bird testing unit on the front lines of the West Nile virus, an Arctic graveyard of the victims of the 1918 flu, a polio-eradication team in India, and an epidemic of the avian flu. She has reported on outbreaks like H5N1, anthrax, West Nile, SARS, H1N1, and Ebola. She's the creator of the site Today in Ebolanoia, which has been cited in medical and biodefense literature for documenting public overreaction to disease threats, and her work has also appeared in Annals of Emergency Medicine and the Bulletin of the History of Medicine. I could have talked to her for hours. She's a wealth of knowledge on the food industry and the coronavirus. Thank you so much for taking this time. I'm really excited to talk to you, and it just turned out that it's a perfect time to talk to you. So I'm first going to start with your background on the antibiotic industry. You've been researching this for many years. How did this start?
So first, thanks for having me. It's really exciting to talk to you. I am a journalist focused on public health and global health, and for a bunch of years I was assigned to write about the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which happens to be 2 miles from my house here in Atlanta, where I live. I spent some time following their young disease detectives around the world through disease outbreaks, and I stumbled into an outbreak that one of them was researching about antibiotic-resistant infections in a particular city. And I found this just fascinating. I had no idea that antibiotic resistance was as serious a health threat as it is. And I didn't know that because of antibiotic resistance, antibiotics were losing their power. We were essentially running out of drugs. So I started researching that. And I wrote a book about how antibiotic resistance began in hospitals and moved out into the everyday world and how we were not ready for it. And in the process of researching that, I discovered that probably the largest use of antibiotics in the world day to day is not actually in healthcare. It's actually in agriculture. For most of the time that we have had antibiotics, really from the beginning of the antibiotic era, we have been routinely feeding small doses of antibiotics to the livestock that we eat. And that has contributed to antibiotic resistance by putting antibiotics out into the world for the bacterial world to react to.
What percentage of antibiotics is in the food industry?
So the best estimates, and they can only be estimates because not every country has a reporting or a testing system. The best estimate is that 2 to 3 times as much antibiotic is used in agriculture as is used in human medicine. And when I first stumbled across those numbers, I was completely stunned, because the first place my mind went was, how could so many animals be so sick? Because of course, that's what we use antibiotics for in humans, is to cure sick people, is to cure infections. But it turns out that very little of the antibiotics that are used in agriculture are going into sick animals to make them well. Instead, what we use them for is to create sort of systemic effects that were discovered very early in the history of antibiotics, which is that if you feed small doses of antibiotics to animals, they will put on weight faster. The doses interfere with the mix of bacteria that live in their guts all the time and cause them to put on weight more quickly. And slightly larger doses of antibiotics protect animals from diseases of crowding that may occur when they are held in very large numbers in barns or feedlots. But none of that is actually curing infections in animals.
Did the farmers discover this, or was this discovered in the lab and it was told to the farmers?
It was absolutely discovered in the lab. And the history of how this happened is really fascinating. So if you think back, I mean, none of us were around at the time, but the early history of antibiotics is that Alexander Fleming, whose name I think everyone has heard, discovers penicillin in 1928 in his laboratory in a hospital in London, when he's been working on growing Staphylococcus bacteria on plates, on what we would think of as petri dishes. And he leaves a window open in his lab because it's London in 1928. They don't have air conditioning. And when something blows in the window, and when he comes back to clean off those plates and reuse them, he discovers that some of the bacteria on the plate have died. And what killed them was tiny specks of mold that blew in the window on the breeze that are excreting a compound that kills the staph. Well, that mold was penicillium, the kind of blue-green mold you might see on a moldy piece of bread. And the compound was the first natural penicillin. So in the 1940s, that gets developed into a drug, changes the course of World War II. Huge public enthusiasm for these new miracle drugs that cure infectious disease for the first time. At the same time, because there's a war on, there's a great deal of spool up in the infrastructure that produces meat to get soldiers and sailors fed. And as soon as the war ends, that guaranteed market goes away, and meat producers panic over how they're going to keep their industry from collapsing, and they start looking for cheap dietary supplements that they can give to livestock so that they can start buying cheaper feed and still keep the livestock healthy. And in the midst of all of that, a scientist working at a company that makes one of the first antibiotics, actually the first tetracycline, which came out in 1948, has the idea to use as a dietary supplement for livestock what's essentially the manufacturing waste from making his company's antibiotic, which is the kind of leftover stuff, carbohydrate and dead bacterial bodies that the drug was brewed in. He gives tiny doses of that dried antibiotic waste to a set of experimental chickens, and the chickens get fat. They put on weight faster than a chicken that's not getting the antibiotic dose. And out of that, an entire industry is born. So that observation that the chickens are getting fat happens on Christmas Day, 1948. And within 5 years, just in the United States, farmers are giving their livestock 500,000 pounds of antibiotics a year. And now it's up in it's at something more than 25 million pounds a year in the US in the most recent federal data, which is about 2 years old now. It's astonishing how much antibiotic we use.
Was the poultry industry the first meat industry to use antibiotics?
They were, and in fact, chickens are really important to this whole story because chickens are the first species, this first type of animal that this gets proved in the lab. They're the the business that uses it first, though it moves very quickly out into the pig and cattle industries as well. And if you follow this long story through, just now in the United States, changes are happening in the chicken industry to reverse this historic misuse of antibiotics. So I like to think of it that chickens taught agriculture how to misuse antibiotics, and now chicken is teaching agriculture how to wind that back again.
So how does that different than the industrial meat and fish, or is it given to fish? I mean, I know they give antibiotics to fish now. Do they do it for fattening, or does it work that way with the other animals?
So there are two uses of antibiotics there's three uses of antibiotics in animals. The sort of most obvious use is the way we use antibiotics, which is actually to make sick beings well. Then there are these two other uses of increasing weight and protecting against disease. And in certain species, those two kind of blend together. So the doses are not different enough that you can say, oh, this dose is only for weight gain and this dose is only for prevention. So to answer your question, all species of meat animals that are raised in confinement, that are raised in a barn, in a shed, in a feedlot, it is when they're grown on industrial scale, they routinely get those unless their industry or their producers have actually made an affirmative decision not to. In the case of fish farming, this is also true. Now, in the United States, we don't have open water penned fish farming the way it exists in, for instance, Scandinavia or in South America or in Asia. But there have been good analyses done of what's going on in salmon farming, for instance. And it's very clear in other countries that antibiotics are part of the feed that penned farmed salmon are given. In that case, it's more to prevent disease than it is to actually make them gain weight. But the side effect is that they gain weight as well.
So you wrote Big Chicken. What year did you write that?
Big Chicken came out in 2017, and its paperback came out in 2019.
And since you wrote that book all about the antibiotics in chicken, what's the changes you've seen?
So I happened to write the book at a moment when reforms were starting to happen. I discovered this long history of misuse of antibiotics that no one had really talked about. I think I signed the contract for the book in the summer of 2013. And as I was writing it, change already started to happen. So it turned out that I had to rewrite the last third of the book a couple of times because literally things were changing as I was doing my research. So I'll tell you the story of what happened that's documented in the book, and then let me tell you what's happened since. So in 2014, the chicken company Purdue, which is the fourth largest chicken company in America, kind of nowhere announced that they were going to take a stand against antibiotic use in chicken. They summoned a press conference in Washington, D.C. at the end of 2014, and their chairman, Jim Purdue, who's the grandson of the founder, stood up and said, we have a message to impart. We are going to take our production antibiotic free. In fact, we've been working on this for 10 years, and we are most of the way there already. And that announcement really was like an earthquake in the chicken industry because no one else was working on this. And it made Purdue very unpopular with their fellow chicken producers. But now...
Quick question. I remember them, weren't they one, or was it Tyson saying that there was nothing wrong with antibiotics back then?
So a number of producers pushed back against what Purdue was saying. And said, we think these are necessary or we think they're not important. But now, 5.5 years later, every chicken company in America has followed Purdue's lead. And last year, more than 50% of the meat chickens, the broiler chickens raised in the United States, were raised with no antibiotics at all. So every major chicken company now has at least a label within their portfolio saying this chicken is no antibiotics ever, NAE, or raised without antibiotics, RWA. The entire industry has converted to follow the lead of Purdue chicken. And so that happened, that conversion of the rest of the industry happened after big chicken was out in the world. And other sectors of the meat industry are following this lead. So now pork producers are looking into going antibiotic free. McDonald's has committed to taking antibiotics out of their global supply chain for beef. And pork and cattle are a little harder than chicken because chickens don't live very long. The average meat chicken these days only lives about 42 days, and it spends those 42 days in a single barn. Pigs and cattle live longer, 6 months to a couple of years, and they get moved around during their lives. They might move from barn to barn or from property to property or get shipped across the country, and all of that means they're more exposed to pathogens. So it's harder to grow them for their entire lives without antibiotics. But people are really trying because they understand the threat of antibiotic resistance. And more important, from my point of view, they understand that this is what consumers want.
Does that mean, so if the chicken industry is moving away from antibiotics, are they changing the conditions that the chickens live in? Because I would assume that in these crowded chicken farms, they're going to need antibiotics because they're so close to each other.
That's a really good question. And that's absolutely correct. That's what they're doing. So I have spent a lot of time with Purdue in particular, although I also have been in with on farms that are connected to other chicken producers. And Purdue actually did a lot of work, and they did it in a very scientific manner to see what would work and what did not work. And what they settled on was to change the conditions under which their animals were raised in such a way that it would support their immune systems without using antibiotics. So here are some examples. The first thing they did was they reduced what's called the stocking density. That's literally how many birds are in a barn, which is called a house in chicken industry parlance. It could be up to 35,000, and they reduced it a bit. So a few fewer birds per square yard or square meter. They gave the birds the opportunity to exercise. They put in the barns things like bales of hay and shipping pallets propped up on one end and little swings and things like that, so the birds could walk around and get their blood flowing, get blood perfusing their muscles. They changed their diets. They both purified the diets. They took out like rendered animal protein, that was sort of waste protein that the industry routinely uses, and they added back in essentially natural antiseptics. So things like herbs and essential oils and other sort of botanical remedies, things like thyme and oregano and cinnamon that are kind of natural antiseptics to keep the gut healthy. And a thing that I particularly love is that they paid for all of their farmers to be able to cut windows in the walls of the chicken houses so that the birds would get natural light, which is a thing that they did not otherwise get in the chicken industry. And who knows whether there's actually some actual effect on the immune system from getting natural light, or if it's just that the birds are happier and less stressed, but it seems to work. So all of that is making the lives of the birds a bit better and allowing them to not be so vulnerable to illness at the same time.
I get my chickens from a local farmer, obviously, that doesn't use antibiotics, and it seems like the chicken industry is moving that way. If we eat antibiotic-free meat, does that cause us to have a better immune systems? Does it make us, eating these foods that have antibiotics in it, does it create us to be antibiotic resistant, or what's the cause?
So that's a really good question, and this is a little complicated, so bear with me while I go through the steps. So when we give antibiotics to animals, we're creating a couple of different potential risks. The first is that we are causing in the guts of the animals for antibiotic-resistant bacteria to develop. That is, bacteria that no longer respond to the action of antibiotics, that can defend themselves and that won't be killed. When animals, this is happening in their guts. So their gut contents, their manure, contains antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which they then poop out into the world. So antibiotic-resistant bacteria may be present in a farmyard, in a manure lagoon, at a swine barn, in the manure that's sort of like the first ground layer of a cattle feedlot. And those bacteria can then move through the world in a way that we have no way of tracking. And not only can the bacteria move, but the resistance DNA that they contain, the genetic code that confers resistance, persists when bacteria die and gets taken up by other bacteria. So that's one way that this is a risk, is that antibiotic resistance enters the world as a result of giving antibiotics to those animals. The second way is, and that's why the animals are alive, the second way is that those resistant bacteria may remain on the meat that animals become when they are slaughtered and taken apart, because their gut contents may get onto the meat. So that means that when we buy a package of meat at the grocery store, there may be antibiotic-resistant bacteria on it. And so we can get a drug-resistant foodborne infection. And there have been very large outbreaks of drug-resistant salmonella, for instance, over the past decade that are clearly traced back to antibiotic-resistant bacteria traveling on meat. Now, an important thing is that the meat itself does not contain antibiotics. That's antibiotic residue, as opposed to antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And antibiotic residue is one of the few things in this process that is actually regulated by the government. It's not legal to sell an animal that has antibiotics in its flesh. It almost never happens. So we're not at risk from taking in antibiotics ourselves as a result of antibiotics being given to animals. What we're at risk from is the resistant bacteria that are created when the animals got antibiotics.
That's so interesting, because I think in everybody's mind they think they're eating antibiotics, but it's the antibiotic resistant bacteria that we end up ingesting.
It's really actually pretty unusual for animals to be found by the FDA with antibiotic residue in their flesh. The place where it's most likely to happen is when dairy cattle that are no longer good for milking are sold for beef, because the dairy's use of antibiotics is slightly different than beef cattle, pigs, and chickens, because the cows are doing different things on a dairy farm. They get higher doses of antibiotics, and they actually farmers have to go through what's called a withdrawal period, in which they are not giving antibiotics to their dairy cattle for a certain period of time before the cows are slaughtered. And if that withdrawal period is not observed, then it may be that they still have a dose of antibiotics in their systems when they die, and that residue may be present in their meat. So if you, as people like me do, if you are obsessional about reading FDA reports about beef production, you may, periodically see a notice that says, the FDA is busting this farm because they were selling cattle that had that tested positive for antibiotic residues. But it's actually really kind of unusual.
As the common consumer, how are we to protect ourselves? Like, should we only be buying organic meat? Does that even matter? Like, what do we do?
So my belief is, having, intensively studied this history, that the reason that we got reform in the meat industry with regard to antibiotics is that consumers took us there, is that both large industrial caterers, the people who do buying for universities and medical centers and public schools, and also everyday consumers like moms and dads, it was because people were asking for antibiotic-free meat that the companies responded. Companies, for the most part, they're not charities, right? They're not altruistic. They are there to make value for their owners and their shareholders. And they saw a value in responding to consumers asking. So So first, I think it's really important for people to know that their buying behavior got as far as we did. The way to move this even further is to keep buying, to find the products that are labeled antibiotic free, to buy them. And if they are not present in a store, to go up to the customer service desk or to find the store's website and say, this is what I want to buy. I want you to start sourcing it, because enough, and do that not only in supermarkets, but in fast food chains as well. One of the biggest movements right now is toward all the various fast food chains starting to buy antibiotic-free meat. Now, do we have to buy organic meat? So a problem here is that organic meat can be more expensive, because organic is not just antibiotic-free, right? Organic is that the animals are raised in very different conditions than very, large-scale protein production. They may be slightly different species, slightly different like types of chicken or types of pig, and they're inevitably more labor intensive. That raises the price. So if you can afford if you can afford organic standard meat, that's great, because that is that's a sector of the market that deserves to grow. But people shouldn't feel bad if they're buying styrofoam tray chicken, so long as it's antibiotic free, because by buying antibiotic free, they are protecting themselves and their families, and they're helping that sector of the market, those companies that are committing to this, to get a bigger foothold.
I read an article, I don't think you wrote it, or I heard you say it, that the fruit industry uses antibiotics. I was really surprised about that.
Yeah.
Can you?
I
was like, oh my God, really?
Right. So the thing about antibiotics is that they kill disease bacteria, right? And so there have been for a long time diseases. There's two different things that are going on right now. First, there's been a long-term use of a particular class of antibiotics in apple and pear orchards. So this is like in New York State and in Michigan in particular. There's a disease of those fruit trees that can be killed by common antibiotics. And an important thing to say here is that the reason why this is all such a problem is that the antibiotics we use in animals and the antibiotics we use in crop agriculture are the exact same ones that a doctor would use on us. The reason that it's important that resistance is being generated is that the resistance that occurs in bacteria because of what happens in agriculture is resistance to a drug that we would get in a medical office. It's not as though there's one kind of drug that's used in agriculture and a completely different kind of drug. It's all the same drugs. So there's this disease of apples and pears. The common name for it is fire blight, that can only be suppressed with a particular antibiotic. So those trees get sprayed. But the biggest use right now is to try to save the citrus industry from a disease that is commonly called citrus greening, or Wanglongbing. And it is a disease that is killing the citrus groves in Florida. It is really, really putting the orange industry in Florida under grave threat. Now, Wanglongbing is complicated, this citrus greening disease, because it's carried by an insect that penetrates the bark of the tree and essentially injects this pathogen into the circulatory system of the tree, which runs on the inside of the bark. That means there aren't very many places where you can sort of get to the circulatory system. And so in desperation, what the citrus growers have started doing is fogging the citrus orchards with massive amounts of antibiotics, hundreds of tons of antibiotics. And people who are concerned about antibiotic resistance, NGOs and physicians and medical organizations, just think this is mad, because it's putting antibiotics out into the world for the bacterial world to react to and to potentially develop resistance. And so, it's in this long history of misusing antibiotics, there are competing claims that you keep running into. In this case, it's, do we save the citrus industry or do we protect ourselves against resistance? In the case of giving antibiotics to animals, it was, should we produce meat more cheaply? What if we develop resistance? All of the goals are good goals, but they are all in conflict.
Right. So you had a TED Talk and you mentioned how antibiotic resistance is speeding up. And I think that was in 2017. Am I correct?
My TED Talk was in 2015. Yeah.
Oh, 2015. Okay. And then since that talk, has it slowed down? Is it continue to speed up? Because it's from that talk, I was like, wow, it's every year it seems to be speeding up. And what do we do?
So part of the problem with this is that, ever since the beginning of the antibiotic era, since penicillin came out and then we had penicillin-resistant staph, is that the bacteria and the drugs we use to cure them or kill them have been caught in a sort of game of leapfrog, right? The bugs make us sick. We develop an antibiotic. The bugs develop resistance, so they move ahead of the drug. We develop a new antibiotic, so we get in front of them, they get in front of us, and so forth. That was an unsustainable game. And the reason it's unsustainable is that it's a lot harder to develop an antibiotic than it is for bacteria to develop resistance to it, right? Because resistance is a natural biological process. It's the adaptation of a bacteria to any kind of threat. And, they change their they change their cell walls, they make themselves less vulnerable. But it takes us bacteria have a new generation every 20 minutes. It takes us 10 to 15 years to develop a new drug. And so what's happened, if you sort of draw a timeline of antibiotic development, in the early years of the antibiotic era, starting in the 1940s and up to about the 1970s, there's this huge burst of innovation and many, many antibiotics come out, many different antibiotic classes. And then that huge burst of innovation sort of curves down to become a trickle. And that's where we are right now, is we're just in this trickle in which in the past 30 years, there's only been one truly new class of antibiotics, which is to say one set of antibiotics that has a completely new molecular mechanism that bacteria have never seen before. So that got us a bit of time. But a lot of what pharma companies do is take existing types of antibiotics and tweak them a little bit. And that means the bacteria can go, oh, I've seen this before. I don't have to adapt all that much to defend myself against this. And what that's going to change this situation, what it's going to take is really massive action, probably on the part of governments, to change the way we develop and pay for antibiotics, to make drug companies want to make them again. Because right now there are very few new antibiotics left on the market.
So I want to be mindful of your time, and I think that what's on everybody's mind, and you seem to know a lot about it, is corona. So I'm going to move to that right now. You've reported on other outbreaks, anthrax, West Nile, SARS, Ebola. How does corona differ from this?
So let's be clear about what we're talking about here. Coronavirus is a brand new respiratory virus. It appears to have begun spreading first in China. It looks as though it jumped from some animal host into human beings. That jump from an animal to a human is a very common thing to happen with viruses. A number of the most common viral diseases that we are confronted with originally had animal hosts, so that by itself is not unusual. Because this is a novel virus, none of us have any immunity to it, so it's just moving across the world. And it's really hard right now to know exactly what the toll of illness and death is, because it's very hard to get good numbers. It looked in China as though it was extremely serious, but only the most sick people were being perceived. Like people who might have been mildly ill were sort of not counted, not part of the numbers. But the best the best estimates at this point are that it is, in terms of illness and death, it is more serious than the seasonal flu. It might have illness and death numbers or calculations, proportions that are similar to the 1918 flu, which is a very famous flu epidemic that a lot of us have learned about in the past couple of decades, where a novel flu swept the world. It might be like newer flu pandemics that our parents might remember, 1957, 1968. Those were other times when flu swept the world. It doesn't seem to make everyone ill to the same degree, and whether you are vulnerable or not seems to depend a lot on your age. That's going to be one of the scientific questions that has to be explored. Kids don't seem to be made very ill by it. People who are over 70 and over 80 seem to be in much more danger of serious illness. But because it's a novel flu, a novel respiratory infection, there's no vaccine for it. And there's been no opportunity yet to find drugs that work on it specifically, right? No one's been able to take this into a lab and study it because this is all moving so fast. And what that means is that our only protections against it, until we can get science going on this, are going to be what epidemiologists call non-pharmaceutical interventions, which is the sort of social distancing that you're hearing about, right? People staying home from work or working remotely, kids being sent home from school, people not going to big gatherings where transmission is unpredictable, like, football games or movie theaters or concerts, things like that.
How likely do you think that there'll be another pandemic like this? I mean, you're saying that it came from animals. We have these feedlots right now that, confined animals. What are the odds that we're going to get another, virus from there or from somewhere else?
The diseases that seem to be the most serious are ones that jump not from livestock, not from domesticated animals, but from wildlife. So the last SARS epidemic, so coronavirus is a virus related to the epidemic of SARS that went around the world in 2003. That jumped from wildlife. There's a disease, Nipah, that jumped from bats, primarily affected Southeast Asia. I've actually lost track of how long ago that was. Ebola originally came from non-human primates, as people pushed their villages into the forest edge. So whenever we are at the interface between the world of wildlife and the world of humans, there is the opportunity for primarily viruses, not bacteria, to leap across. The thing that scientists have been pressing for, but there's no funding for it, is to get some kind of surveillance out there at the interface between wildlife and humans to try to find viruses as soon as they jump. But it's a complex and difficult and expensive thing to do, and no one's been willing to build the surveillance engines that would help us find that.
To the response from journalists, from the White House, what do you think about this response? Are journalists really telling us the right information? How about the late response that we got from the White House? Taiwan started their response back in January, and we just heard from the president, was that yesterday, the day before? What's going on? Like, what should we be listening to? What shouldn't we be listening to?
So I think it's a really, really complicated moment right now. I am hearing from a number of very respectable, not alarmist researchers that this is going to be very, very serious. And a number of them are saying that the United States is way behind where we should have been. That we got started very late out of a combination of thinking it wouldn't come here when it was already here, of not getting the testing right for reasons that are still not clear. We haven't yet run more than a couple of thousand tests in the entire United States. countries in Europe and in Asia are doing thousands of tests a day. So something really went awry. A thing that I think is interesting right now is that, to me, as I look across the country, it's the states and the localities that are actually stepping up to make decisions about this more than the federal government is. So, New York City canceling its St. Patrick's Day parade, the state of Ohio closing all its schools for 3 weeks, California either has or is about to ask people not to have very large social gatherings, Disneyland volunteering to close. Those are all decisions that were made in the absence of the federal government saying, we think you should do these things. And so that, on the one hand, makes it chaotic. But on the other hand, it's kind of encouraging that public health entities of various kinds are stepping up, are getting in front of the federal government and the White House and saying, this is what we need to do now to protect our people. So as people look around wherever they live for guidance as to what they should be doing to protect themselves, I would go with your state health department and your city health department if you live in a big city, because it really seems like they are the ones on top of this right now.
So do you think this cancel everything that's going around is the best way to combat this? That people, stay out of large crowds, don't really get together, is the best way we can fight the spread of this? Like, what is that what we should be doing?
There's really good research from 1918, for instance, that cities that did or did not do some form of what's called social distancing had really different outcomes in that epidemic. There's a graphic that's floating around a ton on social media in which people talk about flattening the curve, which is pushing down how sharp the peak of the occurrence of cases is. And the origin of that graphic is actually a sketch of what happened in two different cities, Philadelphia and St. Louis, in 1918. So in the absence of any kind of vaccine or any kind of treatment, slowing down transmission so that not too many people get sick at once and we don't overwhelm hospitals, that's kind of all we've got. Is the amount of closing that's happening right now an overreaction? Possibly. It's hard to know what's the appropriate amount. Do you say, yes, we'll close colleges, but we don't close elementary schools? Yes, we'll close Disneyland, but we don't close down basketball games. I think, and if this works, if it works to slow it down, we won't know how much of it was necessary versus how much was an overreaction. We'll just know that it worked. The problem, of course, is that while we're doing that, staying home, not going to school, not going to concerts, not getting on airplanes, we're severely suppressing the economy. And exactly what is the right amount of, commerce and circulation to allow to keep the economy from crashing while not making people sick, that is a really complicated equation. And I don't think any of us know now if we're actually solving it right.
It's funny because my kids, they announced that school will be closed till mid-April. They're doing online schooling. And we're actually on spring break right now. But I was thinking, how do they know when to, put school back on? How do they know timing if someone, anywhere, like Disney World, they decide to open up and someone was somewhere a week before? To me, it's like, you just don't know. Like,
this is going to be one of the really difficult questions, is if you decide to ask your economy to chill, to send people home, to stop public gatherings, to dissolve schools, how do you know when to stop? How do you know when it's okay to resume everyday life again? And what we're going to need for that is to know, what we'll need is either people become immune because so many people have gotten the virus and gotten over it. And remember, not everybody, 85% of people apparently just have mild illness. We either get a vaccine or we develop natural immunity because so many people got sick. But the way we'll know that is when the testing is better, right? Because at this point, we don't know who has had the disease already. We don't know how long it's been here. When I looked at the numbers yesterday, there have now been positive cases in 46 states. We're heading toward it being all across the country, probably within the next couple of days. But there have only been a few tests done in every state. So it may actually have spread more widely than we know. We may be further along the curve than we know. But it'll take having really good testing to be able to say, okay, enough of us are immune now that it's safe to go back in public again.
So a quick Google search of your name came up for recent articles of how to make your own hand sanitizer.
That was very popular, yes.
Can you tell us?
Sure. So again, in the absence of having a treatment or a vaccine, the things that we do there are other things that we have to do to keep ourselves from getting infected. And what we've been talking about, social distancing, staying home, sending kids home from school, that's one way. But another, even the more important way, is to actually keep from taking the virus into our bodies. And a way that you do that is to just wash your hands a ton, right? Keep your hands clean, because it's our hands that are the bridge between the potentially infected world and our bodies, right? Our hands convey things every day to the vulnerable mucous membranes of our mouths and our noses and our eyes. So if you can, what you should do is wash your hands, warm water and soap, 20 seconds, sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or sing Happy Birthday twice, or sing I Will Survive. If you get up to the first chorus of I Will Survive, that works too. But if you can't get to soap and water, you can use any kind of antiseptic that kills pathogens on your hands. What most of us use is hand sanitizer, because hand sanitizer has in it alcohol buffered in a gel that is not so harsh on your skin. If you've been to a supermarket or a drugstore recently, you may notice that hand sanitizer is sold out everywhere. So it is possible to make your own, though people are starting to tell me that the ingredients are sold out as well. The simplest recipe is rubbing alcohol and aloe vera gel, both of which you can get in big jugs in the drugstore if they're not sold out. The key thing is to make sure that when you mix it together, the alcohol content is 60% of the mixture or more. So the recipe that I put online was one that uses 99% isopropyl alcohol and aloe vera gel, and it's 2/3 of a cup to 1/3 of a cup. But if you have an alcohol that has a lesser percentage, that's 91% or 70%, you have to tinker with the recipe. You have to get out a calculator and figure out how can you mix it together to get you to 60% alcohol in the final solution. So it might be you do 3 parts to 1 part or 4 parts to 1 part. You can actually just douse your hands in alcohol. That also will kill pathogens. Hydrogen peroxide does the same. The problem is that it's really rough on your skin. And the main reason to have a hand sanitizer is that if you're going to use it lots of times a day, it doesn't rip your skin up. And the reason that's important is that our intact skin is one of our body's defenses against pathogens. So you don't want your skin to be dry. You don't want there to be cracks or sore spots. So it is possible to make your own hand sanitizer if you can find the ingredients, and you can't find made hand sanitizer in the market.
Last question, and this is a personal question. So I read an article you wrote about meat allergies, and it appeared to come from your investigations, it came from ticks, that people have had meat allergies that they eventually figured out that they had a tick bite previously. I've been recently diagnosed with Lyme disease. Should I be worried about some type of allergy that could come from Lyme disease? How do we prevent these tick-borne diseases? And is this all related to this antibiotic resistance and these viruses? Is tick just another thing that we should be worried about?
So it's not related. At first, I'm sorry about the Lyme disease. Good luck. Many people have mild cases, but when you don't have a mild case, it can be difficult to manage, and it requires that you have a really sensitive physician working with you. So I wish.
I actually did not know, and he just happened to test. And I'm like, really? And then I started thinking back on things like, I started Googling, because that's what everybody does. And I'm like, I don't sleep so well. Oh, That could be a sign of Lyme disease. I have some new hearing issues. That could be a sign of Lyme disease. But I thought I didn't have any symptoms, so I had no idea.
So this is not related to antibiotic resistance or to the spillover of viruses from wildlife, except in the sense that it underlines for us that the world is a pretty complex and sometimes terrifying place. To explain this allergy briefly, the short name for it is alpha-gal allergy. Alpha-gal is short for alpha something galactose, which is actually a sugar that occurs in the protein alongside the protein in mammal meats. And what's thought to happen is that, ticks have complicated life cycles in which, as they are moving through different parts of their life cycle, they bite different things. So they might start out biting a mouse, and then they bite a deer, and then they bite us. The hypothesis is that ticks, when they bite one of those other species, maybe let's say they bit a deer, they might have taken the blood meal, sucked up the blood from the deer, digested it, but had some fragment of the deer, the proteins of the deer blood, remaining in their guts or in their mouth parts. Then when they bite us, it's like giving us a little injection. And we develop, that's a priming dose. It tells our bodies, next time you see this fragment from a mammal, react as though it's an allergy, react like it's a foreign thing. And so then when we consume the meat from a mammal, we have that allergic reaction. And it's really weird. It's a weird allergy, because normally when you're exposed to an allergen, you have a reaction pretty quickly. If you have spring allergies, for instance, you go outside, your pine tree is blooming, as happens here in Atlanta for, a week every year. We're all covered in tree pollen, and you immediately start sneezing. But with alpha-gal allergy, you don't get the allergic reaction until your digestion starts. So you might eat meat for dinner, go to bed, and wake up in the middle of the night having an allergic reaction. The answer to this, unfortunately, since there's no treatment at the moment, is to stop eating mammal products. So people who have alpha-gal can't eat beef or pork, but they're okay eating poultry. So they eat chicken and duck, and they eat other birds like emu. For instance, emu is considered to be very steak-like, and they generally have no trouble eating fish. People who have very serious forms of the allergy also react to other mammal products, and that's things like gelatin, which can be developed out of animal protein products. So that means you have to be careful what kind of vitamins you take, or whether you're taking a drug that has a gelatin capsule around it. Some vaccines have animal serum, a blood component in them, and so you can have an allergic reaction to the vaccine. Some people have even reacted to something like lanolin in a lip balm, or to wool in a sweater. So, and the way that people react is very just dependent. It's kind of mysterious. It's dependent on their individual immune systems. So when people have alpha-gal, sometimes it's minor and sometimes it really changes their life, and it's really a diagnostic puzzle until they get it figured out.
Well, thank you so much. Should we expect another book from you soon?
I have had a book idea, and I've been starting to move toward, but like every other science writer in the country, my life has gotten co-opted by coronavirus right now, so I'm not exactly sure when I'll get back to it. But I'm in a happy place when I'm writing books, so I hope it will be soon.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. And I know that there's probably so many more questions that I have about corona, but we've been on a long time, and I know you're busy. So thank you so much. And I appreciate all your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Maryn McKenna, for speaking with me. You're an invaluable resource of knowledge, and I could have spoken to you for hours. I know many of you most likely have more questions, but I hope you get some good information from listening to this episode. Remember, we are all interconnected, and everything we do has an impact. The spread of the coronavirus is teaching us this important lesson. Please use this time to reconnect with your family and your community. Reduce travel to give the environment, the skies, the air, and our lungs a break. This is an invitation to turn inwards and reconnect with ourselves. Wash your hands and please stay healthy and safe. To find out more about Maryn McKenna, please see the show notes on my website, eatwelltraveloften.net. You can reach me with any comments or recommendations or reviews at melissa@eatwelltraveloften.net or on Instagram and Facebook, Eat Well Travel Often Podcast. Thank you. Eat well and travel often.